Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
When you're faced with an unjust law, it's not that, if it's an unjust law that's directly against God's law, like, for example, let's say the killing of innocent people, then obviously you can't have anything to do with that. Mm-hmm. But if it's an unjust law that's sort of imposing something which they have no right to impose, then you've got to use prudence. Because let's face it, if they're the ones that can actually lock you up if they want to, if they say, well, we've seen that with some pastors. What did Jesus Christ do when he was faced with the unjust command to be put to death? Well, he actually submitted, and the reason for that is not that he had to, but that he chose to, because that in fact was the best thing for the salvation of the world. And so in the same way, when we're faced with, let's say, unjust laws which are shutting down the church, then we have to say, well, what's the prudent thing to do? Not just to say, well, okay, we're going to kind of put ourselves as lambs to the slaughter. That's fine, as long as it's actually the prudent thing to do. And it would be if we had unity and leadership. One guy can stand up there. We saw that with Pastor Arthur and the other pastor's name I've forgotten. So they stand up, Pastor James, yeah. And there's also the pastor in Ontario who's been also holding services in Aylmer. So these guys stand up, but ultimately they're on their own. And I think what we really need is leadership. We need our leaders, and in the Catholic Church, the bishops, to actually stand up and say, okay, this is how it's going to be. And what can the government really do against that?
Canada's government believes that trampling on people's right to freely practice religion is essential to ending a virus that they've failed at ending for well over a year now. It doesn't matter whether or not the community of people you feel led to worship with and pray with have ever been linked to a single COVID-19 case. Nor does it matter if they have a comprehensive COVID-19 plan in place that makes IKEA look like a COVID cesspool in comparison. If an unelected political health lord forbids you from worshiping your actual Lord with others, you'd better comply. After all, this is Canada. We drag pastors off to prison faster than a politician can say, hey, what about their charter rights and freedoms? Now, I take that back. Of course, they could say that, but almost every single one of them takes every single penny we pay them to sit in the position of power that they are in and says absolutely nothing about the inhumane way our government has spiritually starved and punished people of faith. But you know who isn't afraid to speak up? Father David Cherry, a Quebec-based priest originally from Ireland who is currently serving as the District Superior of Canada for the Society of Saints Pius X. I sat down to interview Father Cherry, and he believes that Christians and even bishops should in fact remind the government of their place when it comes to the church. You're going to want to grab a coffee and watch this interview in full, because if anything I just said resonates with you, you'll find what Father Cherry's opinions are just as refreshing as I did.
I don't think that the government is sort of necessarily singling out the church and saying we want to persecute the church. I think what's happening is that the governments, by and large, I mean, there are exceptions in the world, but almost all the governments in the world, and I would say here in Canada, the government is saying, hey, we've got all the power, and we can do whatever we decide to stop this virus from spreading. Now, the thing that I am particularly worried about, like you could say, is that what the government is saying is that there are no rights except those which we grant. So if you go to church, it's simply because we say that you can. And if for a good reason, let's say, we say you can't go to church, then you can't. Whereas, in fact, the reality is that some rights come from God, who is the author of nature, and those rights we call natural rights. So I have a natural right to life, for example, and no human power has a right to take away that natural right from, let's say, a person who's not guilty of an extremely serious crime. So the government can't say, okay, we don't like Irish people, so you are going to be executed. The government can't do that. And in the same way, there are rights which come to us from God who has revealed himself. Those we call divine rights. And that in particular is the right to worship God in the true religion, in the way that he has asked to be worshipped. And the government can't come along and say, hey, do you know what? You don't have that right anymore. So what I would say really is that, okay, let's imagine, and I mean, you know, personally, my personal opinion is I think that the government is way overreacting in general to the danger of the coronavirus, but that's just my personal opinion. But let's imagine that, you know, it's a really serious threat. What the government could do is it could say to the church, look, you know, there's a pretty serious virus out there. Could you do something yourselves in order to make sure that going to Mass is safe? Make sure that you know, that it's not a reckless thing, let's say, for lots and lots of people to crowd in. And then, but we can't tell you what to do because your right doesn't come from us; it comes from God. And what's really worrying me is that the government is actually saying, hey, we've got all the rights. We're telling everybody what to do. And that, in fact, and I hope I don't sort of, you know, sounds like I'm over dramatizing it, but that actually is totalitarianism. That's totalitarianism is not, okay, let's put on some Nazi helmets and let's go and shoot everybody. Totalitarianism means that the only society, the only root, let's say, of rights is the totality, which is the state. Families don't have any rights except what the state gives them. And, you know, church, let's say, doesn't have any rights except what the state's given. And that's a very bad principle. And that, I think, is the root of what's wrong in what the government is doing in relation to the church during this pandemic.
So, what exactly is the church supposed to do with that? I mean, there's so much talk about separation of the church and state, and a lot of people believe that you're not supposed to be political. So, what's your opinion on that?
Well, my opinion is that in some ways, you know, and I said this to my parishioners when things, you know, opened up last June or July, whatever it was. I said, hey, you've had it very difficult going to Mass over the past few months, but in some ways, don't blame the government. In some ways, blame the bishops. And the reason I said that is that the government, in some ways, you know, many of them, they're very atheistic. They sort of refuse to accept that there actually is a God to whom society owes duties and a God whom society must respect. But the bishops, in fact, they should know better because the church receives its right to save souls, to teach, to rule, and to sanctify from God. It doesn't receive it from the government. And all history has shown how the church, well, let's say until the Reformation, the church has constantly refused the right of governments to control it. Go back to St. Thomas à Becket, St. Thomas of Canterbury, who was slain in Canterbury Cathedral by the knights of Henry II. Why? Because Henry II said to the king, hey, why don't you get your head out of the church's affairs and trying to name bishops, and let us do that because we are the authority within the church. And he was killed for that. He was a martyr for the liberty of the church. Or you go back even to Magna Carta, which happened about 20 years later. Magna Carta was that great document, foundational, I would say, not only to, let's say, English law, but to Canadian law, because that's where we get a lot of our laws from. Magna Carta starts off with the king saying, I will respect the freedoms and rights of the church. That's number one in Magna Carta. And so the bishops should know that, okay, the government says, fine, we're going to tell you what to do. And the bishops stand up and say, no, you're not going to tell us what to do, because we have our rights from God and not from you. And in some ways, that's the big disappointment is that, let's say, there's the pandemic is serious. And I think particularly the coronavirus is potentially quite dangerous, let's say, for people with underlying conditions and older people. These people, they need to look after themselves so as not to be exposed unduly. But what the church should say is, okay, we can see what's going on here. This is what we're going to do, but we're not going to do just what you say because you say it. And in some ways, you think to yourself, well, the government is making up ridiculous rules about church. So you go to your Costco or you go to your Walmart and you take a flight, from Toronto to Vancouver, and, everybody's packed in there like sardines. And, but we're stopping the curve, But you go to a church and you got these huge churches, made for 2,000 people, and there's 10 people allowed in there. You say, well, what exactly is going on there? What the bishop should be saying is, we make the rules within the churches. It's not up to you, not up to the government. We understand we have to be prudent, but hey, we're big. We're not kids. We know what we need to do here. And that's been a big disappointment, I think, for many people, is that the bishops, in a way, have said, okay, there's this deadly pandemic going on. What do people need in a deadly pandemic? Well, they actually need things like the sacraments, and they need things like religion, because we're in a time, let's say, of mortality. So people need to go to confession, people need to receive Holy Communion. But instead of that, the bishop said, okay, we're just going to do whatever the government says. And the government, in many cases, thinks that buying alcohol and cannabis is more important than going to Mass. So the bishops should be standing up and they should be saying, we're opening the churches, we're opening them prudently. And if you want to shut them all down, then go ahead. You're not going to be able to do that.
Yes, well, I agree with that as well. Now, have you been pretty vocal about your opinion on this? And if so, how has it been received in the Catholic community?
Well, I mean, I've been vocal in the sense of I've been telling our faithful, our parishioners, that these are the actual principles of what should be going on. But you have to remember as well that it's not new that the government overreaches. I mean, this is going all the way back to Nero claiming that, oh yeah, it's those nasty Christians that have set the city on fire, so let's kill them. I mean, the entire history of the church has been that of governments overreaching, so nothing new. So what do you do in that situation? I think some people say, well, you should just forget about what the government says and just open up anyway. And I would say I agree if we have leadership. Mm-hmm. If we have leaders like the bishops who stand up and say, hey, we are the church, we are the Catholic Church, this is what we're going to do, and just get over it. But if the bishops are actually saying, oh, well, we accept that the government has the right to shut us down, which they shouldn't be accepting, and then, you have individuals who say, okay, well, we're going to open our church, then actually, I mean, I don't know if that's very prudent. When you're faced with an unjust law, it's not that, if it's an unjust law that's directly against God's law, like, for example, let's say the killing of innocent people, then obviously you can't have anything to do with that. Mm-hmm. But if it's an unjust law that's sort of imposing something which they have no right to impose, then you've got to use prudence. Because let's face it, if they're the ones that can actually lock you up if they want to. If they say, well, we've seen that with some pastors in Alberta, I think.
Right.
Who
I was going to ask you about them. Yeah.
So yeah, I think what did Jesus Christ do when he was faced with the unjust command to be put to death? Well, he actually submitted, and the reason for that is not that he had to, but that he chose to, because that in fact was the best thing for the salvation of the world. And so in the same way, when we're faced with, let's say, unjust laws, which are shutting down the church, then we have to say, well, what's the prudent thing to do? Not just to say, well, okay, we're going to kind of put ourselves as lambs to the slaughter. That's fine, as long as it's actually the prudent thing to do. And it would be if we had unity and leadership.
So when you saw, Pastor James Coates being imprisoned, as well as very recently, Pastor Artur Pawlowski, what was your opinions on that? And did it surprise you in any way?
Well, it did, and it didn't. It surprised me in the sense of, it looks really bad when you're actually dragging pastor, along the road and putting him into a cruiser for the offense of opening his church. It looks really, really bad. And so that surprised me that the authorities, let's say, would have that sort of bad publicity. But in some ways, I guess it's not that publicized. I mean, I don't know, but I imagine it's not really making the headlines on every media outlet. It didn't surprise me in the sense of if one guy sticks his head up over the parapet, then of course he's going to get picked off. If 1 million guys stick their heads above the parapet, then, well, there's not really very much that you can do. And so I think, it's that idea that actually we're all sort of accepting this fact that's sort of been put upon us, and not just in terms of the lockdowns, but in terms of many, many things. We're accepting the fait accompli that actually the government has all power. And it's not true. It's not true. Individuals have rights, families have rights, and many of these rights are natural. They don't come from the government. The government cannot tell families how they are to educate their children. But in many, many countries of the world, it's the government actually tries to monopolize education.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be accepting that because it's not actually real. It's not the natural order.
Yeah, I believe we're seeing that as well right now in a lot of ways. So where I am, and from what I see in Canada, there seems to be a lot of Protestant Christians speaking out and sort of taking a stand in their own way. I still think the vast majority of Protestant churches are in fact closed and complying. But I mean, that's what we tend to see in the news, and that's who tends to reach out. There is a pilgrimage. I call it a protest. It's easier to say. But it has been taking place since November in Vancouver, and about 200 parishioners show up and worship and pray. And so that has been going on here. But other than that, I haven't really seen or heard of a whole lot in the Catholic Church. Is that the same scenario in Quebec, or are you having a different experience out there?
Well, in Quebec, in fairness, I would say the government has been a little bit less unreasonable than in some other provinces, in the sense that even in red zones, which is almost sort of the most highest level of lockdown, where you have many restrictions, they do allow 25 people to attend religious services. Now, that's 25 people regardless of how big the church is. Whereas if you go to a shopping mall, there might be a sign up at the entrance to the shopping mall saying capacity limited to 2,000 people. But anyway, the thing there is that I think, for example, as a Catholic priest, I have a duty when people want to access Mass, which is the worship of God, and the sacraments, that I can't just say to them, "I'm sorry, it's too dangerous." I mean, that doesn't make any sense, and it's actually a dereliction of duty. So I think that in many cases, perhaps quietly, without sort of sticking, your head above the parapet, as I said. I think a lot of priests, I think, within the Catholic Church are doing that, but there are cases I know of where, for example, bishops, such as the Bishop of London in Ontario, who are saying, okay, well, the government has locked everything down, so, we're not allowing anybody to go to Mass or anybody to go to the sacraments until such time as the government decides. And I think that that is scandalous, because I have a right, for example, a guy came to me last year, a couple came to me and they said, oh, Father, can you help us? But in our diocese, we can't get a baptism. I was well, what do you mean you can't get a baptism? Well, we've been told that we can get a baptism once the pandemic is over. I'm saying, well, hold on a second. If the pandemic is killing people, then surely that's even more reason for you to have your child baptized.
Wow.
So I guess, there's a mix. There's a mix. I think there are, let's say quietly, I think, with prudence in terms of, if people, and I say this to parishioners, if you've got COVID, you have a duty in charity to stay at home. I mean, let's not inflict this on other people. You're perfectly justified to stay at home. But if everything's prudent and you're well, then you have an absolute right to go to Mass and to receive the sacraments. And hey, the government has no right to stop you. And I suppose it depends where you are. In as I say, in Quebec, certain zones like orange zones, I think 100 people can go to church, and that's more reasonable because
that is wow. That sounds like
yeah,
almost like back in the day,
That's correct. That's correct.
Wow.
But I think the essential thing is that people need to actually say to the government, hold on, you're the government, we owe you respect. You have powers, you have laws, and we must obey them. However, you do not have the power to do anything that you want to. And that was the old understanding, let's say, of things. In Magna Carta, for example, which, as I mentioned, is one of the foundational documents of let's say, our civilization. It is that, the king's got rights, but they're limited. He can't just do anything that he wants. And I think we've kind of forgotten that.
Yeah. Well, I'm in a province where the political health officer, tells us where faith is, and how to practice that. And there is no difference across the board in the province on how many people can gather. It's 10 while you're doing your Zoom, your Zoom service. And of course you can come individually for prayer or something like that, but gathering is 10, and including outdoors, even though science supports that we should, in my opinion, after reading studies and stuff, there's no reason for any restrictions outdoors, really. So what do we do with this information? What do the brothers and sisters in the church who have been patient for over a year, they never wanted to be activists, but they're understanding that there is an overreach here, and where do we go from here?
Well, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that the way to solve our problems is really, first of all, through prayer and sacrifice, because this is one aspect, let's say, of the hole that the world has got itself into, but there are many other aspects which have followed on from the rejection of Christ. Which, when I say the rejection of Christ, I don't mean by any means that everybody's rejected Christ. What I mean is, a lot of societies and a lot of governments have rejected Christ and said, we do not want you to reign over us. And therefore we can do whatever the heck we want. So we've got things like abortion, euthanasia, and you could go on with all sorts of other things which the government has no right to allow, or in the case we're talking about of the current restrictions, no right to stop. And so I would say, look, in some ways you could be tempted to say, I'm just giving up. But no, because we do have a nuclear weapon, which is prayer. And you saw the example of that in Moses and the Israelites are fighting against the Amalekites, and as long as Moses kept his hands up, the Israelites won. And when Moses started getting tired and dropping his hands, the Israelites started losing. So that is prayer. You may not be familiar with this, Drea, but in 1917, which was the year of the Russian Revolution, Our Lady, so Mary, appeared at Fatima in Portugal, and she predicted, she said that the errors of Russia would spread throughout the world. And she asked in 1917 that Russia be consecrated to her Immaculate Heart. So Russia be kind of set apart as a sort of a special gift, in the same way as England years ago was called Our Lady's Dowry. What's really interesting is that what are the errors of Russia? Well, the errors of Russia are a materialistic atheism. That's the error of Russia. It's materialism is that all that matters is just this world, what you can see, what you can eat. Death, that's the end. So you've got to be really scared of death. And atheism, there's no God. We don't care about God. And in fact, that's what has spread around the world. And that doesn't mean that the people in authority are sort of, secretly plotting to destroy us. It's more like they've got this really false philosophy, which has terrible consequences. In Russia, we saw how it actually led to the slaughter of tens of millions of people. But even in our societies, it is leading to the slaughter of innocents, both young and old. And these are sort of these are things that we can fight against by prayer and by sacrifice. So I would say in some ways that's number one, because that's the sort of that's a nuclear weapon, if you like. But also, I think we need leadership. It's one guy can stand up there. We saw that with Pastor Arthur and the other pastor's name I've forgotten. So they stand up, Pastor James, and there's also the pastor in Ontario who's been also holding services in Aylmer. So these guys stand up, but ultimately they're on their own. And I think what we really need is leadership. We need our leaders, and in the Catholic Church, the bishops, to actually stand up and say, okay, this is how it's going to be. And what can the government really do against that? But in failing that, then I think that we can try to do what we can in terms of contacting our politicians. I don't think they're listening to us. Contacting our politicians, taking legal cases. The problem with the Canadian legal system is that it says that all the rights in the Charter of Rights are conditional. So if your right to something is just conditional, then, well, okay, this pandemic is enough to actually justify your right being taken away. So I don't have a lot of confidence, to be quite honest, in the Canadian justice system vindicating rights which it only sees as conditional and therefore coming from the state. However, I think things like you suggested, this, I think is it outside the cathedral in Vancouver, this rosary?
Yeah, across the Holy Rosary,
Yeah, I think things like that are good. And I know that here in Quebec, for example, on probably about 5 or 6 occasions, we've done the same thing, but outside the Parliament building, the National Assembly, as it's called. And I think things like that are really good because, it actually helps us a lot to be together, to sort of, show that actually we're not crazy. This is actually correct. It is correct to say that, no, the government does not have the right to stop us from doing things. And I'm slightly diverting the subject here a little bit, but it just reminded me that at some stages last year when the government was saying, well, actually, you're not allowed to go and see your dying parent. And I'm thinking, you don't have the right to say that. You can't tell somebody whether they've got a right, even if, this is going to be really dangerous for me, which in fact it wasn't, because, they had all this protective equipment, etc.
Right. There are limits. There's lots of stuff we can do to be together.
Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are telling me that I cannot see my dying? Now, in fairness, I think a lot of that has been toned down. I think now in hospitals, they tend to be, I know a case recently where a young boy, in fact, died, and one of my colleagues was asked to go to the dying person, and he was just waved right through. There was no hassle about, are you allowed to come in? They were very understanding. So I think there are good people, there are good people out there who are saying, okay, this is it's just a humanity to actually tell people, your parent is dying, of course you can go. So anyway, sorry for getting sidetracked there, but no. I think those are the things, is that really we have to see this as something which ultimately is in God's hands. And if these things are happening, we probably deserve this to wake us up. And
I think you're right. Yeah, definitely. And it seems to be something that's happening more often. I just came from Kelowna. There was a worship protest / wedding with about hundreds there, and that was great to see. And it's been happening in the Lower Mainland. I'm not sure if you're familiar with our Fight the Fine Civil Liberty project that we do here. We crowdfund to offer free legal counsel to Canadians who have been, charged or fined for some of these tyrannical restrictions. And a lot of times that it happens to be Christians, whether it's street preachers or, opening their church. And one of them is Pastor David Marks, who was fined for having two over the limit while he was doing a Zoom service, not open church service. And now he's been recently in trouble with for street preaching, but he has churches in Russia. And he said that they're looking at Canada there and they're saying, what's going on? Like, they're way free compared to us, and they just can't believe it.
Yeah, that's very true. And I've heard that remark from people who have come to Canada from Eastern Europe, older people who knew Eastern Europe when Eastern Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. And they're saying, this is the way it used to be. This is bringing us back to our childhood. And the government says, but hold on a second, it's only because of the pandemic. But that's the whole point, is that you can always, and the communist authorities always justified it by saying, this is necessary. We're not doing this to harm you or to stop your freedoms. We're doing this because we have to make society more just. Or we have to make society, and in a sense, you see this sort of rhetoric in the United States when they're saying, okay, well, we have to force society to become more equitable.
Right.
Well, actually, the point is that if you vindicate everybody's rights, then these things work themselves out. Okay? But you can't have a sort of a top-down approach saying, hey, we're going to solve all the problems. And they're really saying, we know better than God does, because when our Lord Jesus Christ came into the world to save us, he didn't come in and saying, okay, here's a load of laws that I'm going to get the police force to enforce to make everybody be good. Rather, he said, I'm going to live my life, and I'm going to die and rise again, and then everybody is going to be able to unite themselves to me through baptism, faith, and a good life, and I am going to heal the world in that way. But it wasn't a sort of, let's force everybody to do this.
Right.
It's just interesting quote from Pope Pius XI. So back in the 30s, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical condemning National Socialism, so Nazism. Of course, the politically correct thing to say is that the Catholic Church was hand in glove with the Nazis. But of course, that's completely false. They actually condemned Nazism, and many, many priests and bishops were put up in concentration camps. But I'll just quote one thing from it. He says, one must judge the axiom that right is common utility. In other words, whatever is useful, that's what rights are. He says we must give that a correct significance. It actually means nothing can be useful if it's not at the same time morally good.
Right.
In other words, it's no use saying, oh, well, we're going to make the world free of racism, or we're going to make the world free of poverty by taking away people's rights, that doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Right.
And the Pope finishes by saying this: the believer has an absolute right to profess his faith and live according to its dictates. Laws which impede this profession and practice of faith are against natural law. That's it. It's
great,
the government does not have, and in this case, it was National Socialism clamping down on the rights of the church. That particular encyclical was printed by 2 printers in Germany. Guess what happened to them? They were arrested and locked up. How dare you print this stuff? What was the Pope saying? The Pope was saying, actually, the government cannot stop the church from preaching and living the faith.
Wow. Well, listen, I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this. I'll probably have to have you on if you'll let me have you on again. And thank you so much for your words of wisdom.
Thank you very much for your invitation, Drea, and God bless.
God bless you too.
If you haven't already done so, please go to rebelnews.com. Big tech platforms like YouTube are trying to give us the boot. We want to make sure we keep in touch with you no matter where we bring you the other side of the story. So that's rebelnews.com.